All right then, thank you everybody for coming again. Welcome to the fourth workshop in our IFR series from PilotEdge. This is actually the second workshop on instrument approaches, despite the title here. What we're going to do is a recap of some of the material we covered last time as quickly as I can, and then we'll move on to the new material that we were not able to cover. So we'll talk real quick about what we've been covering in the IFR workshops in general, and then we'll move through with lightning speed through a recap of what we covered before, and then start drilling down, and as I said, into the material that we missed. So we'll talk about what instrument approaches are for, some examples of approach types, precision versus non-precision, the importance of understanding approach segments, and then we'll start decoding some charts. Okay, so thus far we have broken down the topic of IFR by phase of flight. When I first started these workshops, I wasn't sure what the best way to tackle it would be, and I remember during my training it was very helpful to focus my study by phase of flight, so I figured why not try that with the workshops? Why don't we break it up by phase of flight? So we started with the departure phase of flight, talking about obstacle departure procedures, standard instrument departures, all that good stuff. Then we moved to en route procedures. That was part 2, talking about airways and the en route structure, how to navigate. Then we moved into the arrival phase of flight, talking about stars, and then we moved into approaches. So the last workshop was on approaches, and we covered mostly, well, in fact, entirely precision approaches, and today we will be moving into non-precision approaches. And by the time we're done with the approach phase of flight, we would have covered pretty much everything you need to know, practically speaking, about flying IFR from A to B, hopefully with just a few exceptions. Okay, so again, a quick recap of what is it that we're talking about here? What's the context? So what are instrument approaches for? Again, some of this will be a recap, but I think it does bear repeating. Instrument approaches are not designed to help you land the plane. They don't always get you to a point from which you can safely land the plane. Their job is to transition from the en route structure, which is the airways, to a point from which you can execute a normal landing. That doesn't necessarily mean that you'll be lined up. This is what I was actually trying to get at before I misspoke. You won't necessarily be lined up perfectly with a runway and down at 200 feet. When I first started flying or looking at instrument approaches, I thought that's what their job was to get you there. And I had a couple of rude shocks when I found some approaches that dropped me off over the top of the airport at 1,200 feet and said good luck. So yes, they're not always about getting you lined up with the runway. Some examples of approach types that you'll run into. The ILS is obviously the most common. Localizer approach, VOR approach, localizer directional aids or LDAs, and visual approaches and contact approaches. I'm not positive that we'll be able to get to visual and contact this time around. It may go into a part 3, but we'll see how it goes. And then we have the distinction between precision and non-precision approaches. This is absolutely critical, and so it is worth repeating one more time what the difference is here. A precision approach is going to provide you not just lateral guidance, i.e. left and right, but also vertical guidance during the approach. Whereas a non-precision approach is only going to provide lateral guidance. It will not provide detailed vertical guidance. That's not to say that it won't help you at all with how high you should be, but it won't give you the same level of precision that a precision approach will when it comes to the vertical guidance. Okay, the segments of an approach. Again, this is not brand new, but it is it's really, really important to understand these. So again, this is why I'm going to repeat them. We have the feeder approach, probably the least understood approach segment in my experience. This gets you from the highway to the driveway, and by that I mean the highways are the en route structure. So the job of a feeder segment is to take you from the highway to the point where you can actually start the approach, which is the initial approach fix. And that gets us into the next segment, which is the initial segment. The job of the initial segment is to get you turned around for whatever direction you arrive from. Its job is to get you turned around and pointed down the chute towards the airport. And it helps you also manage your descent as well. We have that usually leads to an intermediate approach segment. This may or may not be present on every approach, but if it is present, its job is to get you a little bit lower and give you time to configure the airplane. Not a lot of turning tends to happen on the intermediate approach segment, but it is generally used to allow you to get slowed down and get the airplane configured. And the thing to know about the intermediate approach segment, this is why we say look out below on the intermediate, is it's only going to give you 500 feet of terrain clearance compared to the initial and feeders, which will give you a full 1,000 feet of terrain clearance. So if you're going to get killed, the intermediate segment is probably the one that's going to be the one that will do it if you're not flying carefully. I hate to be grim about it, but it honestly is that serious when you're flying instrument approaches in IMC. It requires a great deal of focus and understanding. So intermediate is not the time to relax. Final approach segment is the last segment you fly before you land, hopefully, and throughout these segments, the lateral and vertical tolerances that you're afforded are reduced as each segment ends and a new one begins. So it means exactly that. Things are going to get tighter. So essentially, picture this as a tunnel that you're flying through. The walls are going to be getting closer and closer all around you, and eventually the tunnel is fairly narrow. What that means is if you stray outside of the tunnel, you could hit something. So during the feeder and initial, it's relatively relaxed. You know, if you're off by a quarter mile or a third of a mile, you're not likely to hit anything, but the same is not necessarily true once you get down to the final approach segment. And if things don't quite pan out and you're not able to execute a normal landing, we have the missed approach segment. Okay, so what we did last time was we went through a precision approach plate. We used the John Wayne ILS runway 19 right. I'm actually not going to review everything that we did before because it is quite detailed. So some of it I will skip, and so if you're just joining for the first time and you see me skipping a bunch of stuff, don't panic. Remember, this is part 2 of approaches. Feel free to watch the part 1 video, and all will be clear. But we'll do a quick review of the really important stuff, and then we'll get into the new material. So with that, we will have our approach plate up. Okay, so let's review what we did. The elements of this plate that we have already covered, I'll just name them literally by name. Let me swap to a laser pointer here. Give this a try. Is this effective, this laser pointer real quick? Does that help you see where the mouse was at some point, or is it not particularly useful? Okay. All right then, so we have the name of the approach plate. This is absolutely critical to make sure you're looking at the plate that you think you're looking at. So this is the ILS or localizer runway 19 right approach into John Wayne. This is actually 2 approach plates in one. We spent our entire time talking about the ILS last time. We're going to continue that for now, so we're not going to acknowledge the localizer portion, but don't worry, we will be drilling into the localizer version of this approach plate in the second half of the proceedings this evening. Yeah, I'm glad. Someone just said their cat loves watching the pointer. Yep, red shiny thing. Look at that. Must be going nuts. Okay, so we'll stick with the ILS for now. So we have the briefing at the top here. We've got our frequencies, approach courses, runway lengths, notes, missed approach procedure, lighting systems, all the frequencies you would possibly need to be prepared for the approach. I'm not going to go through any of that because we went through it in grim detail before. So that's all up there. We have the horizontal profile, or the lateral portion of the approach, a top-down view, if you like, is presented here, and that is where most of the detail is. And we'll review the flight track for the ILS approach flown from Seal Beach again. And this, we covered a little bit on the last one. We started looking at the vertical profile, and it's important to be able to jump back and forth between these 2 views relatively seamlessly. because there's some information which is best viewed up here, and then there's some information which is best viewed here, even though there's quite a lot of overlap between the information that's presented. At least in my case, I find it easier to swap between them than to stick with just one. And what we did not cover at all, that is really, really important, is the section at the bottom, minimum section, the one with all the fancy numbers. So we will be covering that in detail, along with the section down here, which is the airport summary. I'm actually not sure entirely what that's called, but the little map of the airport can be very, very helpful. And once we get onto our localizer version of the approach, we'll talk about what all these numbers mean down here. All right, so let's have a look at this approach. Okay, so we had assumed that we had been cleared for the approach from Seal Beach, and we talked about how Seal Beach is an example of a feeder. So going through the segments real quick, this is the feeder segment. It begins at this feeder fix, which is Seal Beach, and it goes until we reach the initial approach fix. So from Seal Beach to Sager represents our feeder approach segment. That's segment number 1 done. And if you recall, we know that this is the feeder, the 049 radial, and we can instantly rule out the 063, the 075, and the 093 radial because they don't have, they're missing critical pieces of information. There's no minimum en route altitude for the segment for the 063, whereas there is for the 049, and there is no distance published. Also, the typeface is different. The line is a little bit more bold on this 049 radial versus the 063. And Moon, it should be there in the, you should be able to see it there in the text. Geneva, if you could do the honors one more time. Okay, so that was the feeder segment, and so we're flying our airplane along. We'll talk about the lateral guidance. I guess we could do the vertical at the same time just to bang it out fairly quickly, but we'll be flying the 049 radial. We can descend as low as 4,000 feet. It's going to be about 19 miles until we get to Sager. At Sager, we're going to execute a parallel hold entry to do our course reversal, and I won't review too many of the details of the parallel hold entry. We did do that in grim detail in the last workshop, so feel free to review that. But we're going to turn the plane around, execute our course reversal, and that is the initial segment of the approach done. So notice we're crossing over Sager 2 times. We cross it once on the outbound. That's the beginning of the initial approach segment. That's why it says IAF, stands for initial approach fix. As we turn the plane around, remember initial approach segment is for turning and burning, so here it is turning us around. It's also allowing us to descend. How do we know it allows us to descend? This is where we have to swap back down to the vertical profile. So down here it tells us that the hold in lieu of procedure turn is flown at 3,500 feet. Notice we were at 4,000 before, so hey presto, the procedure turn is doing 2 things for us. It's letting us descend from 4,000 down to 3,500 during this maneuver. I'll be specific about that. You cross Sager at or above 4,000. Once you cross Sager and you begin maneuvering, you can descend down to 3,500. I'm going into a bit more detail on the altitude portion because I remember we rushed that a little bit at the last workshop 3 weeks ago, so that's why we're kind of picking up from this point. So we're executing our course reversal, we're descending to 3,500, turning around on the parallel hold entry, we're joining the final approach course inbound outside of Sager, and we're maintaining 3,500 as shown here on the plate, and then we cross Sager. This is our second time crossing Sager, but when the difference is now we're down to 3,500 feet and we're established on the localizer heading south-southwest on the 194 heading. So our initial approach segment has done its job. It's turned us around and it's gotten us lower. We're now moving to the intermediate segment, and we know that because Sager wears 2 hats. Sager is an initial approach fix, and Sager Part 2 is an intermediate approach fix. So Sager Part 1 was when we crossed it outbound, and then it puts on a different hat and it becomes Sager Part 2 on the way in. So if you see this notation here, don't be too confused. That's it playing two roles. The trick there is to know what phase of flight you're in and what the context is, and then you can decide, okay, is Sega acting as an initial approach fix right now, or is it acting as an intermediate approach fix? All right, continuing from Sega inbound, we're now on the intermediate approach segment, which means our terrain clearance gets chopped in half from 1,000 feet down to 500 feet. This means this is not a good time to be more than 500 feet off your altitude. It can kill you, so let's try not to do that. After Sega, we can then descend down to 3,400 feet by snake. Now here we do see some redundancy. Recall that on this hold in lieu of the procedure turn, there's nothing here that tells you can drop to 3,500 feet during this hold. Ignore the 3,500 feet over here. That's for something different. That's when the approach is flown from Pomona. What we don't have is anything telling us what we can descend to in the hold on this part of the plate, the top-down view. You have to use the vertical profile. The same is not true for the rest of the step-downs. We can actually see 3,400 from Sega to Snake right there on the horizontal profile or the top-down view as well. I find it a little bit hard to read those numbers. Even after all these years of trying, I still tend to rely on the vertical profile. But if you can accurately discern that information from this part of the plate, then fantastic. That's you're free to use that as well. So we're descending from Sega down to Snake, and we can descend a whopping 100 feet. And at this point, we are using the localizer to navigate towards the airport. We're not yet using any glide slope indication. That won't be happening until we get to the final approach segment. So we're continuing to Snake. To identify these points, a quick review: Snake can be identified in 3 different ways. Snake could be identified as the intersection of the localizer, which we're going to be tracking all the way in. You could also set up your nav2 radio to Seal Beach, set it to 115.7, and dial in 063 radial on your nav2 OBS, and when that nav2 needle centers, it means you're at Snake. So that's one way of identifying Snake. The second way is to use DME off of the localizer, and you can see that Snake is 11.4 DME on the localizer. And the third way of identifying it would be if you had a GPS system, you could enter Snake. Or in fact, if you were to load the procedure into your GPS, which would be the recommended way of doing it, it will load the whole sequence of Sega, Snake, Lemon, Dyers, etc. So those are the 3 ways you could identify Snake. After Snake, we can drop down to 2,300 feet. We'll do that until we reach Lemon. Once we reach Lemon, that is the glide slope intercept point. It is not the point that my mouse is on right now, which is that Maltese cross. That Maltese cross is something entirely different, and it does not exist for us right now in the ILS approach. It's absolutely irrelevant. So we're ignoring the Maltese cross right there. Don't worry, we will be using it when we start talking about the localizer version of the approach. But right now, it's dead to us. We don't care about the Maltese cross. We care a great deal about the lightning bolt right here. The fact that the number 2,300 matches the 2,300 here is coincidental. That will definitely not always be the case. So what we're looking for, the lightning bolt represents the glide slope intercept altitude, and it is 2,300 feet. So the goal is to cross Snake at above 3,400 and then descend down to 2,300 feet, remain at 2,300 feet, and at the point that you intercept the glide slope, that should be at Lemon if you are at 2,300 feet. And that represents the end of our intermediate segment and the beginning of the final approach segment. So this is a very important time. This is your last opportunity to tap on that altimeter and pray that it works. Because honestly, the altimeter is the only thing keeping you alive in these cases, bearing in mind that we might be coming down as low as 200 feet above the ground without being able to see anything. If you ever try that in real life, it is quite an experience. And you're putting 100% faith in the instruments in the airplane, and that is very, very true when it comes to the altimeter. And you really don't have much of a way of knowing if that altimeter is accurate up until this point. This point can be incredibly helpful. So it's easy to kind of be relaxed and say, okay, good, 2,300 feet, intercept the glide slope, and now just track that all the way down. You could be forgiven for doing that. But what you really should do is when you hit that glide slope at 2,300 feet and your instrumentation tells you that you're right on the glide slope, you really, really want to make sure that you're at lemon. Or another way of putting it is, once you hit lemon and you're at 2,300 feet, the glide, the glide slope should be dead center at that point. If not everything is lining up, for example, if you're on the glide slope but your altimeter is reading something vastly different, then you have a pretty significant problem. So this is where all the checks and balances come in. You want everything to line up. You want to be on glide slope, and you want that to be at pretty much dead on 2,300 feet by the time you hit lemon. Because from that point down, you're really just completely relying on the glide slope for your vertical guidance and the number that you're seeing on the altimeter. If you get things wrong, then you could have a pretty rude surprise when you fly the glide slope perfectly down, you get to 200 feet, and you end up actually hitting the ground when you actually think you're at 200 feet. So not to belabor the point and be too morbid, this is a very, very important time, the final approach fix. Which is why it's so frustrating that ATC usually picks that exact time to give you a frequency change. Happens all the time. The way the standard kind of handoff points for ATC are actually really quite incompatible with the amount of workload that's going on in the cockpit at the time. So the only thing you can do as a pilot is to try and be prepared for that and anticipate it. So know that sometime at or before lemon, unfortunately it might be right at lemon, you're going to get a frequency change to the tower. And so that is not the time to be looking for the tower frequency or even leaning over to dial the frequency into the standby and then flipping it over. That's why it is so incredibly important to have briefed the approach in advance, and way, way, way before you get to lemon, you should have 126.8 dialed in on the COM1 standby, and then when they say contact tower, you're literally just pushing one button, which is to flip the 126.8 into the primary frequency. And this is a theme which has kind of come up, I think, in the past, both for the en route and for the departure phase. If you're, especially in SIDS, that's right, I remember it now for SIDS, there should really not be any particular time where you are stupidly busy when you're flying IFR. What you're looking for is a relatively low level of workload on a consistent basis, and in the worst case scenario, it spikes up to a medium level of workload. If you're drinking from a fire hose, chances are something has gone wrong with your preparation for that phase of flight. You haven't arrived at that phase of flight with the airplane configured and with yourself fully briefed. So that's probably something to monitor. If you find yourself going, geez, every time it's all going well up until they always hand me to the tower, and then I'm trying to dial something in and I lose it, and the plane's turning off the localizer, and I don't even have time to double check that the glide slope altitude is right, or that I'm actually at lemon. If you find yourself saying that when you debrief the approach, then you should look for elements that you could have done earlier that would have reduced your workload prior to reaching that point. So Jim had a good question. Is the final approach fix only indicated in the vertical profile view? I see 3 lightning bolts in the top-down view. That's a wonderful question, and it is also actually a shame that they use the lightning bolt in the top-down versus here. What the lightning bolt means up here is entirely different than the lightning bolt down here. There is only one lightning bolt down here, and that is the glide slope, minimum glide slope intercept altitude. The glide slope, the lightning bolt up here means that that part of the diagram is not necessarily drawn to scale, if memory serves. So these diagrams are normally to scale, but when they are not to scale, they will use the lightning bolt. So just at a glance, I'm going to say that let's see, that the same thing is depicted here too, that it's not to scale. Yeah, I'll leave it at that for now. That's my recollection is that's what that lightning bolt means up on the profile view. So no, these are not all final approach fixes. Otherwise, it would be very confusing. There's a final approach fix. There's one. There's one. There's one. So there are definitely not 4 final approach fixes on this approach. I can promise you that. So yep, that's what the lightning bolt means down in the vertical profile. Okay, so we've gotten ourselves to Lemon. Everything checks out. The gear's down. We just got handed over the tower. We've double-checked that we are on the glide slope at 7.9 DME. It checks with the GPS that says we're at Lemon, and the altimeter is reading bang on 2,300 feet. Life is good. We can trust our altimeter as we commit now to the final approach segment. From this point on, it actually gets pretty simple. We're going to ignore dyes. We're going to ignore 2.2 DME. Those are just not interesting to us on the ILS approach. They will be really interesting to us when we review the next approach. How can you tell that by looking at it? It's because there's a bunch of symbols next to it. So for dyes it says 1040, but it has two notes. We have a cross and a hash. The cross says the 140 actually becomes 1040 becomes 1080 if you're not using the John Wayne altimeter, if you are instead using the Fullerton altimeter setting. That's allowing for a potential difference between the ambient pressure at Fullerton versus John Wayne if you're forced to use the Fullerton altimeter. So they're giving themselves a 40-foot buffer. But that's not interesting to us, but the hash is awfully interesting to us, and that's over here. And this says that it's for localizer only. And we're not flying the localizer approach. We're flying the ILS approach. So dyes goes away, and VDP is also not, that's what this little bold V represents here. It's called the visual descent point, and we're not going to be covering that right now. So that is also not of interest to us on a precision approach. So things actually get pretty simple from this point on. We now fly the gauges. We are focusing very intently in our scan on receiving guidance from the localizer and the glide slope, and we're going to follow it all the way down until we reach the end of the final approach segment, which would be at the missed approach point. The missed approach point on a precision approach is actually not a point in space. It is an altitude above the ground, assuming you're on the you're actually on the glide slope. That's one of the fundamental differences between a non-precision approach and a precision approach. So on a precision approach, we're looking for an altitude as the trigger for transitioning from final approach segment to missed approach segment, whereas on a non-precision approach, we're actually looking for a point over the ground. Either measured with GPS or timing or DME or a couple of other ways of finding out where we are. So that brings us very quickly into the world of minimums. However, I'm going to actually, just for continuity, we're going to talk about the missed approach segment, and then we're going to jump into minimums, I promise. Okay, so for us, let's just assume that once we get to 200 feet AGL, again, we'll cover that number in detail in just a bit, but let's assume we get down to 200 feet, we do not see the airport environment, and so it's time to go missed. So we clean up the plane, full power, initiate the climb. I guarantee without even looking at this approach plate, one of the first things you'll be doing on the mist is climbing. There are no consequences to climbing on the mist, at least from the minimum altitude. You certainly will not be descending anymore after the final approach fix. So you'll definitely be climbing. The altitude you'll be climbing to, obviously you need to get from the plate, but that's suffice to say you will be doing some climbing. And missed approaches are customized for every approach. And so you really do have to brief the approach to find out what it is you'll be doing. Some of them involve a turn, some of them involve flying a heading for a bit. This one is relatively simple. And the missed approach segment is defined in two places on this chart. The detailed version, the fully described missed approach procedure, is up here. So missed approach is to climb to 3,000 feet via the localizer south course to Minnow, which is also John Wayne 10.9 DME, or the localizer 10.9 DME, and to hold. So we'll be climbing, we'll be flying on the localizer, and we'll be holding. Another depiction of that missed approach procedure is, This one is not always fully complete, but it does give you some pointers. So climb to 3000 via the localizer south course to minnow. We at least have that on the vertical profile. It's not a full description, but if you have already fully briefed it, which you would have done during your approach briefing earlier, then you could just refer to this and it would give you the prompts that you need, essentially. So what's going on here is here's John Wayne, depicted on the chart. I'll zoom in a bit more, I guess. There we go. We're going mist with using the localizer. This is now the back course of the localizer. So we'll be getting, the sensing will be the same actually because we're heading away from the airport. So we essentially continue to fly the localizer southwest bound, perfectly straight, and we're looking for minnow. They ran out of room on the approach plate, so they ended up having to do a cutout here. So we're flying from the airport southwest bound and then pause, and this point right here is functionally the equivalent of that point right there. So we're heading southwest bound and then we're transitioning into this cutaway view. This is a cutaway view showing you the missed approach fix. The reason they do this is that you can visualize what the hold is going to be. And in this case we'll be holding at minnow, and this would be a parallel hold entry as well. So we would hit minnow, we would fly outbound for 1 minute, we'd make about a 225 degree turn or so, something like that. So we'd go past the 180 degree point, continue turning to the northwest, join the localizer inbound, and then a right turn. Now we're flying the localizer inbound, you hit minnow, and now we're holding and holding and holding, at least in lost communications. You could brief that all you like. Here's what's going to happen when you go missed. Cessna 3 Alpha Bravo, fly runway heading, climb and maintain 3000, tax SoCal departure 127.2. In the real world, you're not going to get the published holding almost ever. This is really a lost communications procedure more than anything else. So don't expect to fly the published missed very often. And I say that so that you're not disappointed that after briefing the approach and setting up all your instrumentation for it, like setting up 113.6 as the nav2 standby, there's a lot you'd be doing during the briefing, including briefing the mist and how are we going to set up the nav equipment so we're ready to fly this. You'll be very disappointed that you don't actually get to use everything that you set up, unfortunately, but you still really do need to do it. So you should be prepared to fly the published mist, but in the real world you're actually not going to get the published mist that often. Okie dokie. I moved kind of quick, but is there any questions so far on what we have covered before we dive into minimums? All right, very good. Let's tackle the wonderful world of minimums. No doubt this is an intimidating part of the plate. Not very intuitive, but once you learn how it's structured, it's really not too bad. So the first thing we'll talk about is categories. Actually, back up one step. What are minimums? Minimums are they describe how low you're able to fly on the approach without having a reference to the airport. So in total IMC, without being able to see anything, this approach allows you to come down to, typically it's about 200 feet over the ground. It also describes what kind of visibility you need to have to be able to continue with the approach. And the visibility is either described in the number of miles or hundreds of feet of visibility. So that's minimums in general. We're going to dive down to that in just a sec, but first we're going to talk about categories, because this is the first thing that we're sort of seeing here is category A, B, C, and D. So let's see what those actually mean. So there are different minimums based on essentially the speed of the aircraft. So approach categories are really talking about the speed of the plane, and they're typically based on 1.3 times the stall speed of the aircraft. That's not a particularly interesting number. What it really comes down to is what speed you're going to be flying the approach at. So while most people are flying the approach at about 1.3 times VSO, If you choose to fly the approach faster, then the 1.3 VSO goes away, and the category that you're in is really the category that you are flying the approach at. So in my airplane, just for practice, I've sometimes flown an approach at 150, 160 knots all the way down at busy airports where I don't intend on landing anyway. And so if I do the approach at 160, that puts me in category D. So at any given time when you're shooting an approach, you need to know what category you're in so that you select the right set of minimums. So category A, it's all depicted here. Category A is less than 90 knots. Category B is 90 to 120. Most people are flying it in either A or B, on at least on PilotEdge, and most single-engine piston aircraft are typically flying the final approach segment, at least, at as a Category B aircraft. Category C, now you're starting to talk about jets, 737, maybe a lightly loaded 747, etc. Category D, you're getting into some fairly heavy planes, probably military planes, and then Category E, as a joke I say, reserved for Mr. Yeager, it's actually 165 knots or more is Category E. And here we're starting to talk about the SR-71, F-104 Starfighter, those sorts of things which fly ridiculously fast. So in those cases you need basically better flight visibility. That's typically what happens as you get into the higher categories. And these are in speed. You know what? I have to think about that for a sec. Is it indicated speed on the final approach? It's really up to you when you slow down, but most people are arriving at the final approach fix at their at the VREF speed or very shortly after they're slowing down to that. So it's your speed on the final approach segment that we're talking about. And you're expected to transition from cruise speed down towards your final speed during the final approach segment. You don't have to arrive at the final approach fix or the glide slope intercept point for us. You don't have to arrive at that at your at 1.3 VSO, but you will be transitioning to that shortly after the final approach fix, most likely. Okay, so let's assume we're going to be in a Category B aircraft. Let's say we're shooting the approach at well, you know what, we'll do Category A. So you might be flying it at 80 knots, for example, or 90 knots. So we'll be a Category A aircraft for today. Okay, so this actually allows us to slice this approach fairly quickly. So there's a whole bunch of numbers, but it's in a matrix, as you can see. And there's Category A, B, C, and D. We know we're in Category A, so we know that we're talking about this kind of section over here. The B, C, and D stuff just doesn't apply to us. So that's already sliced out some of it for us. Now the question is, what's all this stuff on the left? We have S ILS 19 right, S LOC 19 right, and circling. And then we have a whole nother family down here with some repetition. If you are able to identify dias, for which you'd need tool VORs or DME, dias, as you remember, is a point inside of lemon. It's over here. Let's actually do it on the vertical approach depiction. So lemon is over here. Moving further in, we have dias. Remember how I said we don't care about dias because it doesn't apply to our approach? Well, at some point, you actually get to choose a different set of minimums when you're on the localized version of the approach if you're able to identify dias. So that doesn't apply to us. So everything from dias down, we don't care about. Everything for B, C, and D, we don't care about. All of a sudden, this massive family of stuff has just been narrowed down to, let me swap to another pointer, hang on. Oh, that's where that big pointer was. There we go. It's now been narrowed down to this. There we go. So knowing what category you're in and what type of approach we're flying cuts it down by a factor of 5. So all we care about is now we have to decide which of these three minimums applies to us. So if we're flying the straight-in ILS 19 right, actually I take that back. The S I'm not positive what the S, I'm not sure if S refers to standard or straight in. I might have to go look at that. I've never paid too much attention, quite honestly, to what the S means. But so I'm not going to pretend I know exactly what the S is right there. Let me get back to you on what that refers to. But for the ILS 19 right, you know, I think I have a feeling that's to do with standard, because there are different ILSs. There are Cat 1, Cat 2, Cat 3 approaches, which are even more precise versions of this with lower minimums. So I have a feeling this might refer to standard. But in any case, we have our ILS 19 right minimums versus the localizer 19 right minimums versus circling minimums. And we're not ready to cover circling yet, so let's just talk about whether we should be referring to the ILS minimums or the localizer minimums. Well, we've been saying all along that there are two versions of this approach, the ILS version and the localizer version, and we're focusing on the precision approach, which is the ILS. So we get to just focus on our ILS minimums. And don't be fooled by the fact that there's nothing here. The reason there's nothing there is because the number's actually over here. And the reason it's in the center is because it doesn't vary based on category. Take, for example, the localizer 19 right minimums. They are different for category A versus category B versus category C and D. So that's how this is all laid out. So for us, A, B, C, and D doesn't matter. If we're shooting the ILS 19 right, then we only have one set of minimums to worry about. Now I need to clear my annotations. Well, that was surprisingly easy. Okay, so there's our big number. This is what we care about. So we have 255/24 and some junk after it. So what does this mean? Well, first off, let's see if we can find out what the star is a reference to. The star is actually up here in the notes. It's saying that there is a reduction in one of the numbers down to 1,800 feet if you're using a flight director or an autopilot or a heads-up display. Let's not worry about that. So we'll take these numbers as is, which is 255/24. So let's deal with that first. 255 is a reference to the MSL altitude. We can drop, we can fly down to 255 feet. Well, we cannot go any lower unless we have the airport environment or runway environment in sight. The definition of that is actually kind of complicated, and I'll probably just point people to documentation on that. There's a list of something like 17 different things that you can see that comprise the runway environment. But suffice to say, if you see some pretty lights and you're pretty sure that it's to do with the airport, you're in pretty good shape, or with the runway, I should say. So we can drop down to 255 feet, and we must have 2,400 feet of visibility, or an RVR of 2,400 feet. That's just under half a mile. So we need half-mile visibility, flight visibility, and we can drop down to 255 feet. It's helpful to know ahead of time how high that is above the ground, just to prepare you for the potential shock and give you an idea of how low this is going to get you. It's also really, really, really important when you're trying to work out if you're likely to get in or not. Notice that John Wayne is only about 55 feet above the ground. That's great. Let's imagine for a second that it was actually a bit higher than that. In fact, I will, to illustrate this point, because this is a really, really important point, I'm going to pull up an approach plate for an airport that's a little bit higher. This is kind of a trick question on a few tests that I've seen before, so let's pull up this plate. Okay, this is the localized runway 22 into Caldwell, New Jersey. And let's assume that we're doing we're flying to runway 22, the straight-in minimums for 22, and we're able to identify Collie. Collie is this step-down fix inside the final approach fix. So we can come down to 560 feet. That's great. So let's assume that the weather reporting for Caldwell says that it is currently 400 overcast. That's what's in the METAR, or that's what you hear on the ATIS, or that's what you read in a digital ATIS, whatever way you've gotten this weather. The ceiling is 400 overcast. We can only drop down to 560 feet. The question is it worth trying to shoot this approach? Do we have a hope in hell of being able to see the ground if the clouds are at 400 feet, yet this only allows us to come down to 560 feet? Any thoughts? Okay, so one person says that we have a chance. So how is it possible that if the clouds are at 450 feet, let's assume it's a solid deck, you absolutely cannot see it. You cannot see through the clouds. So Jim, that was a good question. Okay, so you'd be forgiven for thinking, okay, clouds are at 400 feet, we can only come down to 560, let's go find another airport. And this is the answer that many, many, many pilots will give you. And the answer, as one person referred to, Gavin said, the cloud heights are AGL. That's right. That the equipment that measures the heights of the clouds is calculating the distance above the ground. 560 feet is our MSL. That's a height above mean sea level. It is not our height above the ground. So you'd actually have to go do some math and say, okay, well, all right, Caldwell is 172 feet above sea level, and you end up having to do some math. And the truth is, that's what this second number is for right here. This is the number that you care about in terms of deciding ahead of time whether it's worth shooting the approach or not. The small number is the one you care about. So yes, it's 560 feet MSL are the minimums, which is 388 feet above the ground. Therefore, if it is 400 overcast, it is worth a shot. Well, it's physically possible that you might be able to see this. And yet, Amos said the clouds vary in altitude. That is true. They do vary in altitude. So it's somewhat of an academic exercise, but there are people who would literally say, oh no, if it's overcast 400 and the minimums are 560, I'm not even going to shoot the approach. Whereas, or you've taken an even more extreme example. What if it's 500 overcast? If it's 500 overcast and the minimums are 560, you might say, well, no, that's too close, I'm not going to do it. Whereas really, you can actually come down 120 feet below what those clouds are reported to be at. Yes, there is variance in clouds, usually not as much as 100 or 200 feet, at least in my experience. There's not that much when you're getting that low to the ground. So this is the number that's really, really important. It is true, yeah, there is variation that's I guess over some distance it might vary a little bit, but I have definitely seen cases where I've shot approaches minimums now a good number of times, and the number that they're reporting is usually pretty darn accurate. I've only had a handful of cases where it was off either way. It's usually pretty close. So that's the importance of that number, 560 versus 388. And obviously as you start talking about airports that are at 400 feet, 500 feet, 600 feet AGL, it becomes even more important to understand the difference. Okay, so we've gotten our height above the ground in terms of MSL. We've gotten our required flight visibility. In that example, it was given in RVR, which is kind of painful, but it's 2,400 feet required flight visibility. And this number after it is very important, is the AGL equivalent of the first number. So that tells us whether we're going to get in when we're looking at or whether we have a chance of getting in when we're looking at the weather. And then the stuff that's in parentheses you can completely ignore. That's I believe it's for military pilots. So you never have to take into account any of the stuff that's in those little parentheses. Boy, that selecting didn't work too well. Okay, let's compare that to, I'm trying to find a better example. Let's look at the circling, no, let's do the localizer minimums for category C or D aircraft. I don't really want to get into what circling is, but if we were shooting the localizer version of the approach and we were in a category C, the requirements are 1,040 MSL, that's as low as we can descend, 1,040, and here we have, the reason I'm covering these minimums is because I wanted you to see this other way of depicting flight visibility, which is in just miles, statute miles. So we require 2.5 statute miles visibility, and we can only drop to 1,040 feet, which is 985 feet AGL. So it practically has to be VFR to get in on the localizer 19 right. Your 2.5 miles visibility and 985 feet. Now when we say you need 2.5 miles, that means two different things. Sorry, it can mean two different things. If you're flying an airliner or Part 135, so if you're on a charter, for example, you're a charter pilot, and the reported visibility is lower than the minimums, you're not allowed to shoot the approach, period, as far as I know. I'm not an airline or charter pilot, but that's my understanding of it. So this becomes very, very important, to the point where at JFK, where the visibility is changing rapidly on some of these foggy days, once ATC reads out, because they're continually reading out these RVR values. It'll drop, say it's 1800 RVR, 2400 RVR, or 3000 RVR, or something like that. They're reading it out fairly frequently, and as soon as ATC reads out an RVR that is higher than the minimums, you tend to start hearing pilots implying that they would not like any more weather reports at this point, please. And I heard a famous recording of a Speedbird, a British Airways flight coming into JFK, a heavy 747, I guess coming from the UK, and the weather was pretty marginal. And ATC finally read out an RVR that was higher than the minimums, i.e. you can now shoot the approach. But the pilots were so paranoid that that would then change in the next 30 seconds or minute or 2 minutes. They then said, if you can hold off on the weather reports, that would be appreciated, because they didn't want to hear that it was below minimums, because the minute it gets announced that it's below minimums, they can no longer shoot the approach. And so it's very, very important for 135 and 121 operators. It's legally binding. They can't even commence the approach if it's below the minimums. The same is not true for Part 91. I can go and legally shoot the ILS 19 right into John Wayne if it's 0-0. It's a complete whiteout, literally 0 feet visibility, and with nothing. You could debate whether it's a good idea to do it or not. It's not that it's unsafe to do it. It's not hard. It's no harder to fly an approach in VFR than it is in IMC if you're just using the instruments. However, from an emergency perspective, if the engine were to quit, it's physically impossible to land there when it's 0-0, at least for a GA single piston aircraft. So you could debate the safety of it from an emergency perspective, but the point is, with your Part 91, i.e. just flying around recreationally, you can shoot any approach you like regardless of what the current weather is. Now you can't descend below the minimum, so let's say it was 100 feet AGL, for example, or 50 feet AGL, the clouds. We can't go below 255 feet MSL if we don't have the required elements in sight. So if we get to 255 feet, we're on the glide slope, and we see bubkiss in front of us, absolutely nothing. You can't say, well, on Part 91, I'm going to go have a look. So please don't interpret what I'm saying as meaning that you can go below the minimums. All I'm saying is you're still allowed to shoot the approach even if the weather is below the minimums if you're Part 91. And yes, it's actually the flight visibility. So if you estimate the flight visibility to be better than 2,400 feet, you can shoot the approach. So at large airports where there could be a fog bank on one end of the runway and not on the other, they might say the visibility is a quarter mile. But if you're able to see the runway from whatever the required minimums are, let's say it's calling for 3/4 mile visibility, if you estimate that your flight visibility is 3/4 mile or better, then you can actually continue with the approach. So it's pretty much done on the honor system. And it's only honestly going to matter during an enforcement action. So if you bang up the plane, they're going to say, well, sir, we noticed you went below the minimums, and the tower was saying that the flight visibility was a quarter mile, and yet the minimums for this approach are 3/4. Did you have reason to think that the visibility was better than 3/4? And so you'd need to provide some evidence that you felt that the flight visibility was better than 3/4 mile in that case. So it is the flight visibility that becomes binding, except when it comes to the RVRs, from what I can tell. So if they're saying if if they're reporting an RVR of 2400, they have different equipment that reports the RVR, from what I understand, than when they're doing visibility of, say, 1 mile or 2 miles or 3 miles, those sorts of things. I believe it's different equipment. So if they're saying it's 2400 RVR, and that's what's going to stop the airlines from being able to shoot the approach. Okie dokie. So we're covering minimums in some gory detail there, but that's the meaning of the minimums. It refers to both flight visibility and MSL value, so how low can you go, and the AGL equivalent, which is important from it's important from two perspectives. One is from the weather planning side, as we described before. So I was on a flight, in fact, going into Caldwell, where the weather was at 400 feet AGL. It was overcast 400 at the time, and I did elect to shoot the localizer 2-2 approach. For that reason, I knew that it was 388 feet AGL with the minimums. So it's important from a planning perspective. It's also important, I think, from a psychological perspective. It's important to know how low you'll be getting on this approach. It can prepare you for what you might be seeing when you break out, how much time you're going to have to transition to just a regular visual landing. And so psychologically, there's a very big difference between breaking out at 980 feet versus 200 feet. Those are very, very different exercises. And so I think, I guess that's why it's worth understanding what that number is, why that number is important, for those two reasons, both weather and psychological reasons. Okie dokie, so those are the minimums for the ILS. So we've talked about the fact that we have categories. We have to know what category we're in, and we have to know which of the minimums apply to us, be it precision or non-precision, and whether we're making a straight in. In this case we are, it's a straight in to 19 right, or whether we're going to be circling the airport. This probably is a good time to mention at least what circling is, roughly, and how it affects the minimums. Let's take an example where it is blowing like stink at John Wayne. Let's say it's blowing 010 at 18, gusting 25, something like that. You can shoot the ILS 19 right, but you probably are not excited to be landing with an 18 knot tailwind. Nobody's excited about landing with a 20 knot tailwind, in fact. So what you'd really like to do is shoot the ILS. Let's assume there are no instrument approaches for runway 1, one left. That is not the case. There are actually approaches for one left, but we're going to ignore that for a moment. So let's assume it's below VFR. We can't shoot a visual. We need to land at John Wayne, and they're landing north. Does that mean we're out of options? No. It means we can shoot the ILS 19 right, and then we can circle for another runway. And so what happens is you shoot it as a non-precision approach. You actually shoot it when you're circling. You fly the localizer version of the approach. You get down to the circling minimums. Notice how much higher the circling minimums are. They are, for us as a category A, 984 feet above the ground, or 1,040 MSL. So that's what you'll be looking for on the altimeter. So we're sitting at 1,040 feet. We don't go any lower than that. Again, look at that difference between 200 feet AGL versus 984. So we're puttering along at about 1,000 feet, no lower than that, essentially, and we're waiting to see the airport. If we get the airport and we have the required visibility, which is 1¼ miles, then we can execute a circling maneuver. And I won't go into grim detail about how the circling is done, but it's a little bit like a traffic pattern, but not necessarily. It doesn't have to be. Depends on what this situation dictates. But considering we are flying at about 1,000 feet, it's actually going to look a little bit like a tight traffic pattern. So as soon as you get the airport, tower will either tell you to circle west of the field or circle east of the field, one of the two, or perhaps they'll leave it up to you. Get my laser pointer back. There we go. So we're at 1,000 feet. They say circle west of the field for runway 1 left. So we break off the approach. We keep the runway in sight the entire time. We have to stay at 1,000 feet. We're only allowed to descend below the circling minimums, which is 1,040, once we're in a position to make a continuous descent to landing. So at some point on the downwind, we'll start our descent, keep the field in sight, and we'll land on 1 left. So we didn't cancel IFR and do a VFR traffic pattern, but we also didn't shoot the ILS 19 right all the way down to 19 right, and that's what circling is all about. It's not the most fun maneuver. It can be pretty treacherous if you're not really comfortable with it. It's also very tricky at night. In fact, some some charter operators have their SOPs or op specs say that they will not circle at night, period. They'll have to go somewhere else before they would elect to circle at night. And I have friends who also have the same opinion. I know of at least 3 people who will not circle at night, period. I've never tried it, to be honest, so I don't know how difficult it is, but it's a pretty treacherous thing, and I've read many an accident report of planes that have wiped out during circling, so it's a bit tricky. But that's what the minimums are referring to there. Let's see. So Mark asked, do you need to keep continuous visual contact with the field? I'm not sure if it's a legal requirement. Practically speaking, I'm not sure how else. It can be very tricky to circle if you don't. You have to stay relatively close to the field, and if at some point you lose contact with the field and you no longer know where it is, you end up having to get yourself onto the missed approach procedure fairly quickly. So yeah, losing sight of the field is really bad news when you're on the circling portion of the approach. Mark's saying you're going to lose visual contact from downwind to base. Not necessarily. It depends on the plane that you're flying. As long as, I guess, if you know exactly where it is, if you know it's directly behind my left shoulder, I suppose that could theoretically work. But there is, in most cases, especially when the circling minimums are down, I did fly circling and approach at, I think, about 500 feet once, AGL, and it looks almost nothing like a regular traffic pattern. You're really staying that close to the field that I literally did not lose sight of it the entire time. And down at those altitudes, you're not really doing any blind flying or by feel. You really are strictly doing it visually by reference to the field. I'll do a bit of reading on that when we're ready to cover, if we do cover circling in a bit more detail another time, and see if there is any kind of legal requirement to do it. Practically speaking, I know that it gets pretty treacherous if you don't. Let's say, maybe I'll change it from saying you need visual contact with the field to knowing exactly where the field is. Let's put it that way. That's probably a safe way of putting it, or a more exact way of describing it. If you know that thing is right behind the strut or just behind your left shoulder, and you see other ground references that allow you to know where you are, that'll probably work. Okay, I think you're probably right. Someone said it's okay legally if you lose contact during normal maneuvering during circling. Gavin, I assume you mean lose contact with the airport. Gotcha, okay. Yeah, I can see how it might be legal. I'm also seeing how it could be the beginning of the accident if you don't, again, I think it comes back to that statement I just made before, which is if you know where you are in reference to the airport, then great. If you have lost contact with the field and you no longer know where you are in reference to the field, that's when you're in all sorts of trouble. Okay, so that let's move on from circling, because there is a lot of other stuff I want to get to. That really covers it on the minimum side. So you have to understand the category of approach that the category of aircraft that you'll be acting as during this approach, and which of the minimums apply to you. So in this case, it's ILS versus localizer versus circling. And in the case of localizer, there are actually 2 different types. There's localizer approach if you are not able to identify dias, which is, again, inside the final approach fix. And then there's a whole different set of minimums if you are able to identify dias. So actually, back to our circling example before, it really would have been more like 584 feet above the ground, which is going to be a very, very tight pattern, as I said. Okay, so I'll move on from minimums, unless there are questions about the minimums portion. Okay, so how would we fly the full localizer in 19, right? Oh, hang on a second. Okay, that was for approach categories, right? So now we're ready to move on to actually non-precision approaches at last. So before I move on to non-precision, is there anything in the precision world that we wanted to cover? Or are we quite happy to move on to non-precision? Okie dokie. So I've been saying all along that this is a plate that wears two hats. It's both a precision and a non-precision approach plate. So far we've been talking about the ILS 19 right. Now it's time finally to discuss how we would fly this as a localizer approach. And we'll talk about what's similar and what's different. Obviously there's quite a bit of similarity between the two, otherwise they wouldn't have crunched it all into one plate. So there are going to be some similarities, but there will definitely be some differences. So we'll talk about how would we fly the full localizer 19 right, and which parts of it specifically are different to the ILS 19 right. The good news is it's all very similar up until about the final approach fix, so we can move very quickly through that part. Okay, so let's assume that the glide slope is out of service, and this does happen from time to time at airports for maintenance reasons, or I don't know, they're pretty touchy things. Maybe someone sneezed a little bit too hard as they were taxiing by and they managed to break the glide slope. So there'll be a NOTAM that the glide slope is out of service. So now you can only fly the localizer approach. So if you're cleared for the localizer or 19 right approach, it's very different than being cleared for the ILS. Okay, so let's assume we're going to be flying this non-precision approach from Seal Beach. We'll zip through this at 1,000,000 miles an hour because it'll now be the third time we're talking about it. So again, it's all the same up until the final approach fix. So snake on the feeder to the initial approach fix, procedure turn, dropping to 3,500, join the localizer inbound. Now we're at Sega Part 2. We're on the intermediate segment, drop to 3,400, to snake, drop to 2,300, to lemon, and now the differences begin. So last time we dropped to 2,300 feet, the glide slope, and dove on in. That was the precision version. Remember, there's no glide slope now. So the lightning bolt goes away, and our Maltese cross comes to life. This is the final approach fix. So lemon is the final approach fix. It's the transition from the intermediate segment to the final approach segment. And remember, on a non-precision approach, there is no vertical guidance. There is no laser beam that we're flying down. So now we need to know how low we can fly, and are there any more step-down fixes inside the final approach fix? And there are. So we have Dyers, which we've kind of suspected all along was going to come to life. Now Dyers is important. So focusing on the vertical profile, we were at 35, then we're at 34, crossed lemon at 23. Now we can descend down to 1040 by Dyers. Dyers is the Seal Beach 0903 radial, or you can identify it by GPS, or you can identify it as 4.1 DME. Once we cross Dyers, we could potentially descend lower. Let's assume for a minute that we don't have DME, so the 4.1 doesn't help us. Let's assume that we don't have GPS. So knowing that we could have dialed in Dyers into a GPS, that goes away. Imagine how busy you're going to be if you only have a single VOR receiver in this plane. What's your first VOR doing? It's tuned to the localizer. That's pretty important. In fact, it's so important that you're not legally allowed to swap it. Once you're inside the final approach fix, you're not allowed to swap that over to Seal Beach 093 to take a quick look to see if you're about to cross Dyers or not. Believe it or not, outside of the final approach fix, so let's say snake, it is legal with a single VOR to swap from the localizer briefly over to Seal Beach 063. I mean, it's suicidal, but you can theoretically do it. You have to actually twist the OBS over to 063, which is going to be a pretty busy time, but you can legally do it. You could use your VOR, you could abandon the localizer just for a sec, swap over to Seal Beach, tune the 063 radial, wait for the needle to move through the center, swap back to the localizer, and then you've identified snake. You can even do that at lemon, I believe, but not true for Dyers, and that's because Dyers is inside the is on the final approach segment. with good reason, right? That's when you're getting down that low, it's not the time to be swapping from the localizer to Seal Beach again. And that's confirmed here. So if you're able to identify dyes, and there's a note here that says you need either dual VOR receivers or DME. So take our minimally equipped case where we only had a single VOR with no DME. That's telling us that it's not only is it not a good idea, we're not allowed to use, we're not allowed to try and use the dyes minimums. What that means for us is these minimums don't apply. The dyes fixed minimums do not apply because we're not able to identify dyes. So 1040 is as low as we go. So we picture what's happening, 35 down to 34, down to 23. We can drop down to 1040 and that's it. So we're stuck at 1040. We can't get any lower than 1040 because we were not able to identify dyes. And if we look at why that is, I'm going to guess it's because of that obstruction just outside of dyes to the west of the localizer. There's a 560-foot obstruction over there. If you were to drop down to the minimums of 440, which is 385 feet AGL, and you did that prior to dyes, and you were off course, boom, you hit the tower over here. So my guess is that's why they have a step down at dyes. So that's how to understand the different sets of minimums on the non-precision, either the dyes or non-dyes. So fly whichever one you can. Let's assume we can identify dyes because we have either GPS or DME or dual VORs. Whatever the reason is, we know where dyes is. So let's fly it like that. So lemon at 23, drop to 1040, sit at 1040 till we cross dyes, and then after dyes we can drop down to the MDA, minimum descent altitude, which is 440. So that's how the non-precision is different from the precision. We now care about dyes. I also mentioned that there's a VDP here. So VDP is called Visual Descent Point. Let's talk about how this would work if this wasn't here for a minute. So let's ignore the VDP again. We're at 1040. We cross dyes. We drop down to 440 rather rapidly, and now we're sitting at 440. And let's assume we see the runway out there and we go, fantastic, let's make a beeline for the runway. You're allowed to leave the minimum descent altitude, which is in this case 440 feet, once you have the runway environment in sight. That's the only time you're allowed to get lower than the minimums, is once you basically see the airport. There must be some sort of terrain or obstruction, something like that, which makes it not a good idea to descend below 440 feet until you're at this 2.2 DME fix. That's called a VDP, a visual descent point. That's what that V is right there. That means you're not allowed to leave the MDA even if you can see the runway. You're not allowed to drop below the minimums until you hit the VDP. Once you get to the VDP, then you can drop from there. There must be, again, there's some sort of obstruction. I don't run into VDPs all that often, but that's how you handle them essentially. So this is the new information that we have that didn't apply to us before when we were doing the precision approach. Now we actually care about them. So we care about dyes and we care about our VDP. Mark said you're not allowed to descend below which MDA? It will be the MDA for the approach. Whichever MDA applies for the approach that you're flying. And the question is, to identify the VPE, would we need DME? That is a good question, actually. You know, if you didn't have... I'm thinking for a minute. It's actually a really good question. If you didn't have DME, if you only had GPS, because there's no fix at the VDP, which is 2.2. Yeah, I guess I know what you could do. You could do it from... Yeah, Jim said if you if you get to the middle marker, you know you can descend. That's true, yes. There is a middle marker after the VDP, so if you were equipped to identify a VDP, you'd be in good shape. The middle marker is actually is also a fix. That's MAGG, MAAGG. So if you were to load this approach into your GPS, it would very likely have MAGG on the approach. So then the question becomes, even if the VDP isn't specifically listed on your GPS, if you know your distance from MAGG, then you'll know when you've crossed the VDP. That's what these little segment distances are for. So the VDP is 0.6 nautical miles outside of MAGG. So let's say your GPS had loaded up, when you loaded the localizer 19 right into the GPS, it would have loaded Sega, Snake, Lemon, Dyers, MAGG, and then Minnow, which is the missed approach fix. So as you're flying through Snake, Lemon, it's sequencing, it moves you to Dyers. The next one it'll sequence you to, most likely, is MAGG. So what you're looking for is 0.6 from MAGG. That's your VDP. Okay, so again, no glide slope on this. We're purely using our these step-down fixes along the way. So the question is, when do you go missed? Remember, the missed approach point we said was when you reach the specific altitude on a precision approach. That's called a decision height, or DH, or decision altitude. I forget what term they've now settled on, but for a while it was DA versus DH. In any case, when you reach an altitude, a specific altitude on a precision approach, that's when you go missed. The same is absolutely 100% not true on a non-precision approach, because the point over the ground that you'll be at which you reach the MDA is completely random. You're not following a specific glide path. There are a million different descent profiles you could use for this approach. There's the dive and drive technique, so you hit Snake, you drop as quick as you can to 23, and you level out at 23. You cross Lemon, drop as quick as you can to 1040, level out at 1040, cross Dyers, drop as quick as you can to 440, and level out till you pass the VDP. So it looks more like this. Ignore the climb, that wasn't intentional. That's what this is going to look like. So if you simply used our minimums here, 440, if you use the minimum descent altitude as your guideline for when you should go missed, then you'd be missing out on a pretty big opportunity, because you'd probably do it here, that point right there, because that's when you hit 440. Well, that's not the missed approach point. That's not actually where the approach calls for you to go missed. The approach calls for you to go missed here at MAGG. So, and you can see that by this transition from a solid line to a dotted line right there. That is the missed approach point. So this becomes the big question on a non-precision approach, which is how do you identify the missed approach point? There's a couple of different ways. So with GPS, it's fairly easy. Again, it's MAGG, right? So if your GPS tells you you're at MAGG, then you're done. If you can't see the airport, you can't safely even if you can see the airport, but if you're too high to make a normal approach to landing, then you go missed. So MAGG is the missed approach point. So it is a point in space rather than a specific altitude. So the big question becomes, how do you identify that point in space? GPS, it's easy, it's MAGG. That's one way of doing it. The second way of identifying it is that this is a locator middle marker. So ILS, an ILS is comprised of much more than just a localizer and a glide slope. It also has other optional components in it, like an inner marker, middle marker, and an outer marker. And these, if you have an airplane that's equipped with these marker receivers, you'll actually get a visual indication when you're passing over the marker, a blinking light typically, and you'll also hear a tone in your headset when you're passing over the marker. So passing over the marker would be a good indication that you've hit MAGG. That's the second way. Let's see, there is also a compass locator there. That's why it says LMM rather than just MM. So the L is important. That means there's actually a low-powered NDB right there. That's why there's a frequency for it. So there is a compass locator. Think of it as a low-powered NDB. So if you had an ADF, in which case 1983 called, and they'd like the navigation equipment back. But if you do have an ADF, you could tune that to 337, and as you're passing over it, you would see the ADF needle swing over. So you've got a couple of different ways of identifying MAJ, but let's assume we don't have any of that. We don't have a locator, a middle marker receiver. My airplane doesn't have a marker receiver, for example. Let's assume we don't have ADF. That's a pretty safe assumption in this day and age. Truth be told, I actually love ADF, but most people make fun of it, and I'm going to succumb to peer pressure and make fun of ADF as well. So we don't have our middle marker. Gavin says he's holding his head low. So we don't have a middle marker. We don't have a compass locator or ADF in the airplane. We don't have GPS, so we can't use MAJ. All of our ways of identifying this fix are evaporating before our very eyes. And again, getting to 440 feet is not a proxy for this. We can't use that to identify it. What we're left with is a stopwatch. We're left with this stuff over here. Amazing, right? When you're shooting a non-precision approach, you're still supposed to carry a stopwatch. And so one of the things you do crossing a final approach fix is start a timer. So when we cross this, we're supposed to start a timer. And here's what this table is telling us. From the final approach fix to the missed approach point is 6.8 nautical miles. Here's a handy table that says if you're doing 60 knots over the ground, that means it's going to take 6 minutes 48 seconds before you hit the missed approach point. If you're at 90 knots, that's us. If you're at 90 knots, it's going to be 4 minutes 32 seconds. So at Lemon, you start a timer. You try and hold 90 knots. Once you hit 4 minutes 32 seconds, you are done. You're looking out the window. Well, you've been looking out the window quite a bit anyway. You're at 440 feet. You've probably been there for a little while if you've dove down pretty much as quick as you safely can. You're sitting at 440 feet. You're sitting at 440 feet. Sit. And what you're waiting for is that 4 minutes 32 seconds. So you get to 432. You either see the field or you don't. You can either land or you can't. If you can't, execute the missed approach. So notice how radically different all of that is from our description of the precision approach procedure. Precision approach didn't have any of that. You get to 253 feet, you see the field or you don't, and you go up again. So they're two completely different styles. That's why it is so incredibly important to understand whether you're flying a precision approach or a non-precision approach. It has little to do with how low you can get on the approach. I mean, yes, precision approaches get you down pretty low, but 440 feet is also nothing to sneeze at, or in this case 385 feet AGL. So what's really different between the two approaches is what goes on inside the final approach fix. And as you can see, non-precision is quite a bit more work. This is the stuff that pilots really need to be practicing, I think, more so than an ILS. ILS is relatively easy, to be honest. Right, so Mark has a good question, which is, how on earth do you make the necessary time calculation on the fly? 90 knots indicated isn't 90 knots ground speed unless the wind is calm. That's absolutely right, and that's why it's called non-precision. So yes, there's going to be some error there. Now again, truth be told, the days where people are flying around with no GPS, no marker, no ADF, not too many people doing that these days. So the chances that you're actually going to be relying on this technique in this day and age are relatively slim. However, if you do have to do it, it's not unsafe to do so. There are all sorts of allowances in the calculations from TERP. So when they calculate this number of 440, a lot goes into it, and I have to think they're also taking into account the fact that your calculation of the missed approach point is not going to be bang on. So if you were to go missed a quarter mile early or a quarter mile late, what would happen? Well, if you were to go missed a quarter mile early on this approach, you would just start climbing early. but you're not turning, you're not going anywhere, you're just tracking the localizer. So if you were to go missed early, no harm would come to you. Let's talk about what happened if you went missed a little bit late. Let's say you were horribly wrong and you end up going missed somewhere here over the runway. So we trucked along at 440 feet right past the middle marker, and we just sat there. 440 feet, 440 feet, 440 feet. Now we think, again, let's assume we can't see anything out the window. Now we execute our missed. It just doesn't matter a whole lot. I take that back. It does matter in the sense that we're now starting our climb late, which means that if we are climbing really, really slow and there was terrain out there, starting your missed approach late can have some implications later on, especially if there's mountainous terrain and climb gradients and things like that. But things would really have to be stacked up against you for it to be truly a big deal. So there is, again, if you're going to be off, you're not going to be off by 5 miles. You might be off by a half mile or a quarter mile, something like that. And I'm guessing that they actually take that into account when they're talking about the TERPS requirements. So they might allow for the fact that based on a non-precision approach, you might be starting your missed a little bit late. And so that may end up knocking up the minimums a little bit, allowing for the fact that you may have started your missed a little bit late. Okay. All right, so there's a discussion here, and this is worth tracking. Someone asked, from the final approach fix to lemon, final approach fix to the middle marker is only 6.3 nautical miles, whereas the chart here said that it was 6.8, and then Reese correctly pointed out that the middle marker is not the missed approach point. Really? Hang on, that doesn't look right. All right, let's look. 3.8 times, plus 1.9 is about what, 5.7 plus the 0.6. Oh yeah. Something's amiss here. It is 6.8 to the threshold. I agree, yeah, we're off by half a mile. I guess the missed approach, that's strange, because that's odd, because the middle marker is depicted here as the missed approach point. Maybe that's only for the precision. Well, I'm going to, I guess it won't take long to add that. We'll add it up one more time. Okay, got my handy dandy calculator. So we have 3.5. My mistake, 3.8 from lemon to Dyers. Plus 1.9 to the VDP. Plus 0.6 to the middle marker. Gives you only 6.3. That's really, I am surprised, I have to say. So the middle marker is not the missed approach point, which it is actually the runway threshold. All right, so I've learned something new on this one. So all that stuff about using MAJ and the compass locator and all that all goes away. Your only way to identify the missed approach point is either with DME, it would be 1.1 DME, or the timing. That's the only way to identify the non-precision missed approach point there. I'm going to see if I can find out about that, because it's very interesting that the missed approach segment is depicted here from the middle marker on this plate. So I'm guessing that's only for the precision. So that would be interesting. Okay, so the question is, what does we're looking at the DME, what does 1.1 refer to? That would be from the localizer transmitter, which is 1.1 miles from the threshold. So the threshold itself of the runway is, the transmitter is, I guess, 1.1 miles down the, away from that. Interesting. Okay. Well, I'm not going to dwell on it too long. This is actually fascinating. I'm really interested in that, but I'm going to move on. Okay, so we talked about the non-precision side. We talked about how the minimums are different. So for us, it's 440 feet with 2,400 feet RVR. And then we're going to look for the field and descend. We can only leave 440 feet if we see the runway environment, the lights and such. I'm not going to go through the massive list, but it involves things like the runway end identifier lights, the edge lighting, the approach lighting system, if it's a specific type of approach lighting system. In fact, this one point does bear, is worth mentioning because it can be useful under some circumstances. You can leave the MDA, which is 440 feet for us. This is really more relevant actually on the precision approach. That's when it's likely to come in handy. So if we swap back to the precision world for a moment, if we were down at 255 feet, we hit that point, and in front of us we see the approach lighting system. There's a Mulser there. I have to honestly look up which type of approach lighting system allows you to do this, but let's assume it's the one that is at John Wayne, just for argument's sake for a second. Let's say you could see some of the approach lights, but absolutely nothing else. You can't see the runway. You can literally only see a part of the approach lighting system. You're now able to descend below this 200-foot mark, or the 255 foot mark. You can come down as low as 100 feet AGL. So for us that'd be 155 feet. You can come down to 155 feet if you see the approach lights but not the runway. I know that seems like it's splitting hairs and why on earth would you do this, but I actually got to do this one time and it was very, very helpful because I got to minimums. I could literally see the approach lights that I needed to see and nothing else because of this fog that was rolling in, and I then dropped down to 100 feet AGL, and then sure enough a few seconds later I was then able to see the runway environment and was able to make a normal landing. Had I not been able to get below that MDA, I wouldn't have been able to land. So that little tidbit is also helpful. But I'm being very non-specific there. I can't remember which specific approach lighting system is required for you to be able to do that. I know it's the one which has basically an artificial horizon. They have a set of horizontal lights that essentially acts as your horizon. That's what allows you to keep your wings level because you're now flying essentially a visual maneuver there. The approach lighting system is shown here. I can't remember if it's an ALSF or if it's a Mulser that lets you do it. But in whichever one it is, and that will be in the regulations, this is where you find out what kind of light system is listed there. And that is why the light system is listed on the approach plate, is to help you with this decision. Okie dokie. So let me see if we covered everything we need to on the non-precision side of things. Any questions off the top of your heads about non-precisions, at least localizer approaches? Okay, we have covered how would we fly the full localizer approach. We did. How is it different to the ILS? We absolutely covered that. Okay, so now we're going to get into more of the ATC side of this, or the practical side of flying approaches, which is at any given time there are three different ways that you might be executing an approach. And so far we have been going into a morbid amount of detail on the first one, which is flying the full approach from either an IAF or a feeder. We've been doing the feeder, which is Seal Beach. The procedure would be the same if we were clear direct Sega, which was that initial approach fix. So we've covered that to death. There's another way of doing approaches, which really only applies on RNAV approaches, I believe. You can be cleared to a place inside the IAF. You can be actually cleared to an intermediate approach fix, and you're able to shoot the approach from there without any more guidance from ATC. That's the second type of, it's the second style of shooting an approach. We're not going to be covering RNAV approaches tonight, so I won't pull up an example of that right now. But that is the second way. So we can either fly it from an initial approach fix or a feeder. That's the most traditional way. Now that RNAV approaches are upon us, you could be cleared by ATC to an intermediate approach fix, and you could fly it on your own from there. By far, the most common way you're going to be shooting approaches in any kind of busy terminal environment is going to be vectors to final. And hopefully that term rings a bell. If you've been flying with ATC at all, either real world or on PilotEdge, ATC says Cessna 3 Alpha Bravo, fly heading 030, vectors to the final approach course. Those words are very significant for you. It tells you a lot about what's going to happen and how to set up for the approach. So let's talk about what's different about vectors to final versus the full approach. We'll get that out of the way. Now when they say vectors to final, we're talking about vectors to join, rather than you flying all the segments, and again this is why we harp on the segments, rather than flying feeder, initial, intermediate, down to final, they're going to skip all that. They're going to take control of your aircraft and they're going to vector you to join the final approach segment. And so let's talk about what that looks like and how it changes our workload quite a bit. Okay, so in the vectors to final case, what's going to happen is, as a pilot, you're guaranteed of two things. Sorry, of a number of things. You're no longer going to be concerned with these different segments of the approach. So this concept of flying from Seal Beach to Sager and doing the procedure turn, identifying Sager and Snake, etc., all of that goes away. You're not going to be doing any of that. You're going to be going wherever ATC directs you. So let's assume we were at Seal Beach. Or no, we'll take another example. Let's just assume we were over here somewhere, just for clarity. At this point, we're being given headings like a 010 heading, and this is just one way you might be vectored for the approach. 010 heading, let's assume it's very windy because moving this mouse is pretty tricky. Then they give you a right turn to say 100, and then they give you another right turn to say 160 and tell you to join the localizer, and there's your vector to final right there. And then you fly the approach from there. Same thing could have happened from over here. We may have been vectored over here and vector to final on, say, a 220 heading, like that, and join. So that's what's generally going on with vectors to final. Most of the approach plate no longer applies. They're just getting us to join somewhere outside of Lemon. This is not going to happen. They're not going to take you and vector you here and have you join. It's illegal. The workload would be through the charts. There's all sorts of problems with doing that. So vectors to final has a specific meaning. You know that you're going to be vectored to join the final approach course no closer than 2 miles outside of the final approach fix. So Lemon is the final approach fix. They're not going to have you join at Lemon. That is actually not legal either, right there. It's going to be somewhere outside of Lemon. Where it can get a little bit tricky is if they vector you really, really far out, if they vector you outside of Snake, and let's say you're doing the localizer approach, it's good to know, are we outside of Snake or are we inside of Snake? Because, sorry, it's a little bit difficult to go from annotating to scrolling. Yes, because if we're vectored inside of Snake, then once we join, we can drop down to 2,300 feet. If we join outside of Snake, then we can only drop down to 3,400 feet. So you do have to maintain some situational awareness, at least on non-precisions. Actually, on precisions too, you have to maintain some situational awareness of where you're going to be joining on the approach. And if you watch some of the cockpit videos that I've recorded, when I'm being vectored to final, you can see me trying to anticipate, okay, are we going to be inside or outside of one of these other step downs? You know for sure it's going to be outside of Lemon. That's not up for discussion. It's just how far outside of Lemon are we talking? Is Snake going to be a factor or not? But that's primarily the difference with vectors to final. So it eases your planning quite a bit. So the question was, will ATC give you an altitude to hold until you join on the ILS? Yes, they will. If we're actually about to cover the elements of an approach clearance, they will give you an altitude to maintain until established on a segment of the approach if you're being vectored. That's correct. However, that still doesn't answer our question of, are we joining inside of snake or outside of snake? So let's say they do tell us maintain 4,000 until established and then cleared for the approach. That's great. So we'll maintain 4,000. Wonderful. What happens once you join the localizer? What altitude do you drop to? Yeah, at that point, once you're on the localizer and cleared for the approach, ATC is not doing anything more for you. So now you have a decision to make. I'm at 4,000 now. I've just joined the localizer. What altitude do I descend to? That should be the thing you're thinking about. And the answer is either 3,400 or 2,300, assuming they had you above 3,400 to begin with. So those are the considerations you'll need to make. Yeah, you have to know where you are at the time you join the localizer. You should be very confident as to where you are along that localizer. Now, ATC will give you your position, but it's of limited use, quite honestly. Sometimes they'll give you a reference to Lemon. They might say you're 8 miles from Lemon. Well, that's wonderful. And that doesn't tell you where you're going to intercept, by the way. It only tells you where you are right now. So the ATC telling you where you are, honestly, is almost useless in terms of answering the question of what altitude do I descend to once I hit the localizer. It's up to you to determine whether you're inside or outside of snake. Yeah, georeference charts would be nice. But you'll need to know where you are along that localizer at the time you join it. So the vectors to final doesn't absolve you of all responsibility. It just gets rid of some of the navigating you'll be doing prior to the localizer. Yes, Mark, that's correct. They're not legally obliged to reference the closest fix. They're obliged to reference a fix on the approach. Okay, so we talked about the mechanics of, or the basics of vectors to final. There's a bit more to it, but we're about to get into that. So you'll need to know at any given time which one you're going to be doing. So again, when you start hearing, the minute you hear them say fly heading 030 vectors to final, that vectors to final part's really, really important, and it means you can not worry about the procedure turn and all that good stuff. If they give you a vector and you're not sure what it's for, if they say vectors for the approach, that doesn't really mean much. It could mean what they could be doing is a delay vector, and then eventually they still send you direct Sega, and then you have to fly the full approach from there. So make sure the controller is crystal clear with you as to whether you're being vectored to the final approach course or not. If you're not sure, then ask, because you don't want to assume one thing and then get the other. Okay, so we've established that you really need to know which one it's going to be. You can generally assume that if you're working with a radar-enabled facility and you're in approaches airspace, if you're talking to SoCal approach, then or Bakersfield approach, or Las Vegas approach, or Yuma approach, etc., Santa Barbara approach, anytime you're with a TRACON like that, generally you're going to be getting vectors to final in the real world. But you can always ask if you're not sure. Also, if for training reasons you want something other than vectors to final, i.e. you want to fly the full approach, then definitely request it, for sure. Just don't be surprised when they say no, at least at the busy airports. Okay, so let's talk about what the approach clearances sound like, and this stuff is pretty important. It gets pretty hairy. Let's jump right down to the bottom for a second. You will need to contend with something like 4 from Snake, fly heading 160, maintain 3000 till established on localizer, cleared ILS, runway 19 right approach. That is what every instrument student fears, and it gets them filled with dread, and they don't know what's going on. That's the kind of worst case scenario. Unfortunately, it happens all the time. So you do need to work up to that. But it can be very, 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 very helpful to understand the progression of an approach clearance, or the layering of an approach clearance, etc. So let's start with the most basic form of approach clearance, and we'll step through what the different types are. And if you can layer this in your mind, then the the final result that we get, which is this really complicated one at the end, will make a lot more sense. So let's start with the most basic form. So the most basic form of an approach clearance is two words. It's cleared approach. That's actually a legal approach clearance. And the big question is, would you know what to do if you were given that if you were given that approach? If you were given that approach clearance. And this is really, really important, actually. It doesn't happen terribly often in the real world, but it can happen, especially in some of the more remote locations. And the very first question that pilots normally have, they normally don't struggle with the lateral navigation. They kind of get, okay, I'm on an airway. This airway leads to the initial approach fix for that approach. All right, I think I can work that out. The big question is, how low can I go? So let's look at that, because it is absolutely worth understanding this with crystal clarity. And there's only one kind of area where it's a little bit gray, and that's the part that I want to knock out, which is prior to being established on the approach. What altitude can you drop to? Mark said it depends on what approach you decide to fly, doesn't it? That's true once you're established on a segment of that approach. Then yes, once you're established on a segment of the approach that you've selected, then there's really no debate as to how low you can go. You're just flying whatever the approach says to do. But prior to being established on a segment of the approach, what do you do? And so, I kind of got ahead of myself a little bit. What does cleared approach actually mean? It means that you can fly any of the approaches at the destination airport. Doesn't matter whether it's an ILS or a localizer or a VOR or an LDA approach or an RNAV approach. All of those are all good. ATC doesn't care. Fly any approach you like. So then the question is, okay, what altitude can we drop to? So let's take a scenario where we're established on an airway. Pull up that plate, or pull up a plate. Okay, so we've established that Seal Beach is a feeder, and we know from memory, hopefully at this point, but just in case, from Seal Beach, once we hit Seal Beach, we can drop to 4,000. We do the procedure turn. All of that's clear, not up for debate. We're good from Seal Beach onwards. No big mystery there. Question is, if you hear cleared approach, do you need to announce your approach choice? Nope. If ATC cared which approach you were doing, they would have either asked you which one you wanted, or they would have cleared you for a specific one. So no, they do not care. Let's assume we were at, give me a moment. Let's assume we were coming in on Victor 459. We're at 7,000 feet on Victor 459, and our routing is Victor 459 to Seal Beach. That was our cleared route. We're on some sort of tech route from the northwest, and it was Victor 459 Seal Beach direct, and we're going to John Wayne. We're at 7,000 feet on Victor 459, and you hear Cessna 3 Alpha Bravo cleared approach. The big question you should ask yourself, and you should know the answer to, is what altitude can I descend to and when? We know that from Seal Beach onwards, that part's clear. 4,000 from Seal Beach onwards, and then it drops from there. We don't need to discuss that part. The question is, we're at 7,000 now. When can we drop down to that 4,000? Any ideas? Yep, when can you drop to, let's say we're at darts, for argument's sake. Okay, 2 votes for at Seal Beach. So you're saying we'd stay at 7,000 feet, which is our last assigned altitude. We'd hit Seal Beach, and now that we're established on a segment of the approach, we can drop down to 4,000, right? There we go. We now have everything we need to see on this screen. We are at darts. I'll make it a little bit simpler. We are just inside of darts, so right where the 25 marker is, right there. Southeast bound on Victor 459. Sorry about all the scrolling. There's Seal Beach down there.
Okay, so Reese is bringing up an interesting point. The other option would be you can descend to the MEA, but I'm not sure. Right, so the instinct that people typically have is, I'm going to sit at 7,000 feet until I'm established on a segment of the approach, i.e. Seal Beach, and that would be reasonable. The actual answer is, you can drop to the MEA right now, and then it's completely legal. I can't remember exactly what the verbiage is in the reg. I think it just says if you're established on an airway or a published segment of the approach. You can descend down to that figure. So believe it or not, if you're inside darts and they say cleared approach, you do not have to wait to Seal Beach before you leave 7,000 feet. I mean, this is somewhat academic. I have to be honest. This will never, ever happen in this part of the world. You're not going to hear cleared approach at John Wayne, and you're certainly not going to hear it 24 miles out from Seal Beach, where they don't care what altitude you drop to. But by the letter of the law, if you were to hear cleared approach, and it's good to understand what the what the regs actually say and what you're allowed to do, so that if it does happen, you know what you're able to do. But you can drop down to 4,000 feet right then, which happens to be the MEA. Let's say, for argument's sake, the MEA was actually 5K. I don't really like that the MEA matches the altitude at Seal Beach, because I think it might confuse people then as to which one is binding. Let's imagine for a moment that the MEA was actually 5,000 feet on Victor 459 rather than 4,000 feet. If we're at 7 and they say cleared approach, you can descend to 5. You'd sit at the MEA, which is 5. You'd hit Seal Beach, and at that point you can now descend to whatever the plate says from Seal Beach onwards, which as we all know is 4K. And from there you could descend onwards. So that part is worth understanding, because I think 75% of pilots I've spoken to, when we've kind of talked about IFR and this topic has come up, at least 3/4 of pilots I've spoken to are under the impression that you have to stay at the last assigned altitude until you're established on a segment of the approach, and that's not true. You can descend to the MEA, assuming you're flying on an MEA on an airway at the time. Okay, so that's the basic case, cleared approach. Let's assume that ATC was a little bit more specific. They said cleared ILS approach. Well, that now rules out anything that is not an ILS approach at John Wayne. Let's say there was an ILS 19 right and an ILS 19 left and an ILS 1 left. Those don't exist, but let's just assume there are 3 different ILS approaches. If ATC did not care which one of those you shot, then they would say cleared ILS approach. It would then be a mistake for the pilot to say, well, which ILS approach do you want me to fly? They've already told you. They don't care. So cleared ILS approach means you fly any of those. Again, this is somewhat moot. I have not really seen this happen, but it is good to understand the letter of the law and what this implies. Honestly, probably the most reasonable time that this would happen is if there's only one ILS approach. So if there's only an ILS 19 right at John Wayne, maybe they get tired of saying cleared ILS runway 19 right approach. Maybe they get tired of saying that all the time. They might just shorten it down to cleared ILS approach. And so if there's only one, then there really is no ambiguity. But if there was more than one approach, you can bet that a lot of people would be confused and say, well, which one do you want me to fly? Again, cleared ILS approach means anyone you like. Now let's step it up to a more specific one. Cleared ILS runway 19 right approach. That removes, not only have they added the type of the approach, now they've added the type and runway to it as well. Okay, so we're starting to build up our approach clearance into something that sounds fairly familiar. So again, if we're outside darts on Victor 459, you might actually hear cleared ILS runway 19 right approach. That could happen. You're not always going to get vector to final. You're also not always going to be given a position and an altitude to maintain. So let's talk about when you're going to be assigned an altitude to maintain on these approach clearances. So if you're not on an airway or a segment, because I've misspelled segment, so if you're not on an airway or a segment of an approach, then ATC will provide an altitude to maintain. I forgot who it was, but someone said, will ATC give you an altitude to maintain? They will under some circumstances. If you're being vectored to final, you're absolutely going to be given an altitude to maintain because you're on a random, you're not on a segment of an approach or on an airway. But even if you're not being vectored to final, you could be in a random spot at the time and they might clear you direct Seal Beach. And if anyone has flown the I ratings, and a lot of people here have, think of the I-6 for a minute. You depart out of LA, you're on the Seal Beach 5 departure, you're in a random point in space, and they clear you direct Seal Beach. So now you're heading towards Seal Beach, you're planning on flying the full approach at Seal Beach, yet we're not on an airway right now. You're not going to hear cleared ILS runway 19 right approach. That's not legal. It's not legal because if you are not on an airway or a segment of an approach at the time that you get cleared for an approach, then ATC will provide you an altitude to maintain until you're established on a segment of that approach. And so in the I-6 case, it would be something like cross Seal Beach. Let's use the full example right there. Sorry, when I click it goes to the next screen, my mistake. But so if we're flying a full approach, you might hear something like cleared direct Sega, cross Sega at 4000, cleared ILS runway 19 right approach. Notice what's missing from that is your position. They never told you how far you were from Sega. That's because they're only required to give you a position when you're being vectored to the final approach course. So knowing when ATC has to issue certain parts of the clearance will make you less surprised when you receive all these different variants of an approach clearance. That's my goal here, is to go through all the different types that you might hear and when they apply so that you're not surprised when you hear any of them. So cleared approach, cleared ILS approach, cleared ILS runway 19 right approach, cleared direct Sega, cross Sega at 4000, cleared ILS runway 19 right approach. These are all different ways of getting this ILS approach that all involve, by the way, flying the full approach. The vectors, the final case, has one additional requirement, which is they must give you your position. That's the one additional piece of information that's required in a vector to final. They must give you your current position relative to one of the fixes on the approach. They won't always give you a heading, by the way. This approach clearance may be split up. You might have heard fly heading 160, join the localizer. This usually means the controller is running out of time. They don't have time to spit out the entire approach clearance, so we break it up into two steps. So Cessna 3 Alpha Bravo, fly heading 160, join the localizer, or intercept the runway 19 right localizer. Now they've given you, you've got the heading, you've been told to join the localizer. What they might give you next is a cut-down version of this vector to final. We've already got the heading to fly. What you're now going to hear is Cessna 3 Alpha Bravo, 4 from Snake, maintain 3000 until established on the localizer, cleared ILS, runway 19 right approach. So for the vector to final, just be aware that there are two different variants of it. There's the one where they're including a heading, and then there's one where they split it up into two phases. One's a heading to join with an instruction to join the localizer, and then very shortly after that, when they have a moment, then they bang out the entire approach clearance. Okay, so Mark said from LAX, yeah, cross Seal Beach at or above 5000, cleared ILS runway 19 right approach. 19 right approach, correct, yeah. And yes, yep, it can happen that you will get vectored through the localizer. That can happen. So let's talk about what happens there if we're traipsing along. Here we are on a beloved vector to final. Cessna 3 Alpha Bravo, fly heading 010, so we're doing that. Boom, 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 boom. Cessna 3 Alpha Bravo, turn right heading 110. Okay, we're doing that. Okay, and then the controller's talking, and the controller's talking, and the controller's talking, and the controller's talking, and the controller's talking. What do you do? The two choices are, do you do that, or do you do that? Yep, keep flying the heading. You don't join the localizer unless they've asked you to do so. Now, if you don't hear anything about it, the controller has made a mistake. A controller will never intentionally put you through a localizer without telling you that. What they would say, let's say there was someone ahead of you puttering around really, really slowly on the approach ahead of you, and they didn't realize they were going to be going that slow, and things are not working out. They're not going to turn you on to the localizer, so they'll say Cessna 3 Alpha Bravo, fly heading 110, vectors through the localizer for sequencing, or vectors across the localizer for sequencing. That gives you a heads up way back here that you're not going to be joining the localizer anytime soon. So now there's no panic, right? You're expecting to go through the localizer. When you want to panic is when they just say fly heading 110 and leave it at that, and now the localizer's coming in. Something has gone amiss. You've been forgotten about, or the controller is just very, very busy elsewhere. In that case, the correct course of action is to continue on the heading, but you should query the controller. So have no qualms about that. As you see the localizer coming in, just say, approach Cessna 3 Alpha Bravo coming up on the localizer. Don't say, would you like us to join? You're just wasting time. Just ping the controller and say, we're coming up on the localizer. Chances are by the time you're seeing the localizer moving, it's not criminal if you say, would you like us to join? But all you're doing is just giving the controller less time to get you to join the localizer, because these localizers are very narrow, and if you're seeing it moving and you're on a 90-degree heading, which, by the way, should have all sorts of... when you're on the 010 heading, know that you're on a downwind and nothing's happening anytime soon. Once they've got you on essentially a right base, i.e. you're perpendicular to the localizer, things are going to happen pretty quickly. So you're anticipating the localizer coming up, you see the needle move, give the controller a couple of seconds at the most, and then say Cessna 3 Alpha Bravo coming up on the localizer. And then the controller will snap back to John Wayne. Maybe they've been distracted elsewhere and go, oh dear, I've forgotten this guy. And that's when you're probably going to hear Cessna 3 Alpha Bravo, fly heading 160, join the localizer. Because they're running out of time. They have not got time to throw out the entire approach clearance. And so they're just going to give you that much. So at least you start the turn and you're in good shape. Maybe they get one or two more transmissions out if they're really, really busy before. And now the next thing you're going to get is your approach clearance. Also, a great time to slow down, quite honestly. If you're on that base leg and you see it coming up, and you know the controller is just slammed somewhere else, have some situational awareness and try and slow the plane down as much as you can. Give yourself and the controller a fighting chance to salvage this before it gets ugly. Because if you do go through the localizer, it is ugly. If it was going to be a fairly close-in vector to lemon, the controller is now running out of options. We can't just get you right back. If I try and draw this, let's say you do go through. We're now in a bit of trouble. We can't, by the time you execute your turn, you're now dangerously close to lemon, and so what you're more likely to hear, again, they have to have you joining the localizer at least 2 miles outside that final approach fix. If it's not working out, what you're probably going to hear is, Cessna 3 Alpha Bravo, sorry about that, turn left heading 010, and they'll get you back on localizer as soon as they can. That's what's going to end up happening. So overshooting the localizer is a real pain. So take the steps that you can, but honestly, the times that pilots end up just joining the localizer themselves, we slap them over the wrist, but then very quietly we thank them in the background saying, yeah, thanks, I forgot about you, or I was busy somewhere else. But by the letter of the law, you're not supposed to join the localizer. And again, remember, if they wanted you to go through the localizer, they would have told you back then, or they should have. So it's kind of unfortunate that you're actually not allowed to join the localizer in those cases, because when it does happen, it is always a mistake as far as I know. Anywho, how much does it happen? I've never gone through a localizer, but that's because I have prompted the controller that it's coming up probably twice in real world. So it doesn't happen often. Quite honestly, it happens a bit more on PilotEdge, I have to say, because just the way we work the airspace is different than the real world. We have a small number of controllers working a crazy amount of airspace. And so we end up in situations where you can be vectoring, I think my personal record is 6, it's either 5 or 6 airplanes at completely different airports. So I've had one at Vegas, Santa Barbara, John Wayne, Fullerton, Santa Catalina, and Lindbergh, literally within the same 10 seconds, all needing an approach clearance. And so that just doesn't happen in real world. You're working a much smaller piece of airspace,
and that just doesn't happen. So it probably happens on PilotEdge more than it happens in real life, honestly. So it's a good training opportunity, though.
Hi guys, what's the special, well, what are you guys doing right now? I haven't really checked the website.
Adam, we're just finishing up a presentation.
Okay, what is this presentation on?
Well, it's we're actually about to wrap up in the next 2 minutes, and it was about 2 hours and 10 minutes long. I'll get back to you in just a second if that's okay. But you can look at the URL at the bottom there, and you can follow on the with the screen sharing if you like.
Roger.
Okay.
Ooh, instrument approach procedures.
Right. Also, if we can, I'm doing the presenting at the moment, and because of the large number of people, we can't really have people talking randomly, if that's okay. So for now, if you can either mute, and then just let me know if you have any questions via the text. Okay, so that's our vector to final. Okay, there's only one more thing I want to cover. We're a little bit over time, but we are literally down to the last slide, so I'm just going to continue and get this finished. So we've covered our basic forms of the approach clearance, starting from the most basic to the most complex, and the spectrum within, and when you'll get one versus the other and what they mean. So now we're going to handle, how to handle the vector to final. So when you do get that really, really big one, let's talk about the elements of that clearance, and most importantly, how you can anticipate it. Because the more you can anticipate, the less of it will be a surprise. And that can really, really, really help you with workload management. And IFR at the end of the day, especially single pilot IFR, is largely about workload management rather than the stick and rudder stuff. So being ready for the vector to final and what that radio call might sound like can really, really help you. Okay, so we call it the PTAC on the controlling side. So when we're giving someone the PTAC, that is that big long clearance, the 5 from Snake, fly heading 160, 3000 till established, cleared ILS runway 19 right approach. So PTAC consists of the position, the turn, assuming it's all being done in one fell swoop. So position, turn, altitude to maintain, and the clearance. We've talked about why these are all legally required, so that's not a surprise. The question is, how can you anticipate what they're going to be? And do you care about each one of them? So at the end of the day, let me cut to the end so we know what the end result is going to be. There's only one figure in this that I care about, or that is news to me, and it's this. This is the only thing as a pilot that I'm really, really, really listening out for that is going to be a surprise. The rest can all be derived. Heaven help you if you don't know what approach you are being vectored for to begin with. If this part's coming as a surprise, something has gone horribly wrong, horribly wrong. I could make a lot more jokes about that because it is quite a funny topic, but that's not a surprise. So ignore that. Your brain shouldn't even really be processing it when they say it. It shouldn't take up any bandwidth whatsoever. The 5 from Snake. Again, you probably don't care so much. You know where you are, especially with GPS. You've been following along where you are on the approach, relatively speaking. So you don't care about that. Nor does the controller want to hear it when you read it back. Just not that important. We're legally obliged to give it to you for historical reasons, but again, heaven help you if that part is news too. So we don't care about that. You'd think that there would only be 2 parts left, but actually this part, once you know a certain set of rules about ATC, this part should also not come as a surprise to you whatsoever. And here's how you can know what this is going to be ahead of time. If we clue you into the secret that we have to give you a 30-degree intercept, no more than a 30-degree intercept to join the localizer, and that we generally prefer to give you 30 degrees as opposed to, say, 10 degrees or 20 degrees, I won't take time as to why that is, but if you can generally accept that it's going to be a 30-degree intercept, then there are only 2 numbers that it could possibly be, and one of them would make no sense at all. So let's look at what those are.
I am not nailing this right now. Okay. Exactly. So it can either be 160 or 220. Here's what 160 looks like. Here's what 220 looks like. If we were on the west side of the localizer, here's a hint, it's not going to be 220. That's just going to take you further away from the localizer. If you're on the east side of the localizer, it's not going to be 160 because that's just going to take you further away from the localizer. So, knowing that we're on the west side of the airport or on the east side of the airport, I can tell you, having never flown this approach in my life, that it's going to be 160 to join. And if we're off by 10 degrees, it's okay. It's ATC is not really going to care, quite honestly. If they did, for some reason, end up giving you 170 instead of 160, and you read it back as 160, it's unlikely that they're really going to care, quite honestly. I've flown a good number of approaches, and I'd also love feedback from people who've flown approaches too. If you are routinely assigned a 10 or a 20 degree intercept on the heading, I would love to hear it, just in case my experience is unique. But the experience that I've gotten so far is that it's always a 30. So that can help you a lot when you're preparing to fly an approach, especially for the first time. And case in point, I did fly an ILS approach during my BFR recently, my biennial flight review, for the very first time at Atlantic City, New Jersey. And I worked out what the approach clearance was going to be while I was briefing the approach. And my instructor looked at me and said, that's kind of odd. How or why are you doing that? And so I told him, some of the assumptions I was making. And in terms of why, I said, because of workload management. The radios in my plane are not fantastic. It can be often hard to hear some of the things the controller's saying. So the position I just don't care about. I know what approach it's going to be. So I'm just checking off parts of the approach clearance and ruling them out, if you like, one at a time prior to getting it. So what I'm really trying to do is prime myself to only listen for the altitude, because that's the one part you can't know in advance. This is going to be the controller's minimum vectoring altitude. Forget what's on the plate. The plate only applies once you're actually established on that localizer. Prior to that, we have to keep you above our minimum vectoring altitude. That's not a number which you as a pilot have access to on any charts whatsoever. So that's going to be completely random. You might start getting to know it as you fly at a particular airfield over and over and over. But if you're just coming there for the first time, you really have no idea what that's going to be. Unless it happens to be very, very flat ground, then it's probably going to be whatever the altitude is for the glide slope intercept. So you might take a guess that it's that. But the heading, the position, who cares about the position? Who cares about which approach it is? The heading we can derive ahead of time, and the altitude is the only part we care about. So compare trying to hear 5 from Snake, heading 160, 3000 till established, cleared ILS runway 19 right approach. And I deliberately mumbled that and said it really quickly, because when you're under pressure and you're learning IFR and you're trying to fly a plane and there's interference on the radio and there's turbulence, you're not going to hear every word crystal clear. So imagine how hard it is trying to digest that compared to blah, 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 3000, cleared, blah, 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 blah. It's real easy to pick out the 3000, right? That's the part you really care about. And so, yeah, Laurie just said, gee, this would have been nice to know back at the I-1. I actually made a very detailed forum post about this recently, but I think, Laurie, you had already gone through your I-1 by then, saying how to prepare for the PTAC, or how to anticipate the vector to final. So I didn't mean to spend too long on this topic, but I think it's really, really worth it, because this is a huge workload saver. This is about the biggest blurb you're going to get from ATC other than your initial IFR clearance. But those IFR clearances are really well understood, and you're on the ground in a fairly sterile environment. The PTAC that you get can be in the worst possible conditions. So reducing this down to just a single number, or if you want to listen for 2 numbers, fine, listen for 2 numbers. That's a lot easier than trying to digest this entire thing. And so your readback can just be heading 160, 3 till established, cleared approach. And please read it back fairly quickly, because it takes us a while to say all this, but we have to legally say all this. What I really want to hear from you is that you know the heading and the altitude, and really just the altitude. So feel free to just give me that part, and I'm happy. Okay, so if you're ready, you'll know everything except perhaps the altitude before it even happens, which is a huge confidence builder. Okay, that is what I have on approaches.